High Exarch Tevlak of the glorious V'tharr Imperium stood on the observation deck of the Sunrender, his flagship, and watched the planet Earth swim in the star-dusted void. It was a jewel of a world, blue and white and teeming with a chaotic, vibrant energy that, he had to admit, possessed a certain primitive charm, a charm he was about to extinguish. The war, so far, had been a textbook V'tharr campaign. Their gilded fleets, monuments to millennia of aesthetic and martial tradition, had shattered the brutish utilitarian ships of the Terran Federation. The human fleets fought with a surprising, almost suicidal tenacity, but they were ultimately no match for the V'thar's superior technology and elegant, time-honored formations. The last of the Terran capital ships had been scoured from the sky over Mars a week ago. The path to the human homeworld was clear. According to V'tharr doctrine, the war was already over. They had achieved void superiority. They had broken the enemy's organized military. The next logical step was the formal, unconditional surrender of the defeated species. The V'tharr would then begin the benevolent, centuries-long process of cultural uplift, gently guiding the chaotic humans into the enlightened embrace of the Imperium. They are a stubborn people. "High Exarch!" chirped Sub-Commander Lethal, his ceremonial armor shimmering. "Their fleet fought to the last, but their spirit must surely be broken now. Their leaders will see the logic of submission." Tevlak gave a slight, condescending nod. "Of course they will. They are a young race, prone to emotional outbursts, but even they must bow to the inevitable, open a channel to their planetary command. It is time to accept their surrender." The message was sent, a grand, poetic declaration of V'tharr victory, offering generous terms of assimilation in exchange for immediate and total cessation of any remaining hostilities. The response from Earth was unexpected. It was not from a military leader or a high-ranking politician. It was a global broadcast, a cacophony of 1,000 different voices in 100 different languages, all saying, in essence, the same thing. The most concise translation came from a gruff, heavily accented male voice from a region their analysts identified as Australia. "Yeah, nah, get stuffed." Tevlak stared at the translated text, a flicker of confusion disturbing his serene composure. "They refuse?" "It would appear so, High Exarch," Lethal replied, equally bewildered. "They seem to be under the impression that the war is not yet concluded. Their fleet is gone. Their orbital defenses are shattered. What is left to fight with? The V'tharr, a species whose entire societal structure was a rigid pyramid of warriors and artisans, had no concept of a civilian population as anything other than a resource to be governed. The idea that the war could continue without a formal army was, to them, utterly illogical. "Very well," Tevlak said, a hint of steel entering his melodic voice. "If they will not be pacified by reason, they will be pacified by force. Initiate the occupation protocol. Deploy the ground legions. We will establish our authority in their primary population centers, decapitate their remaining leadership, and restore order. Let us see how long their defiance lasts when our boots are on their soil." The V'tharr occupation force was a magnificent sight. Legions of their finest warriors, the Sunblades, clad in gleaming golden armor and armed with elegant plasma. Lances descended upon Earth's major cities in waves of ornate, teardrop-shaped dropships. They expected to be met with scattered, disorganized resistance from demoralized police forces. They were prepared for a swift, surgical operation to secure the planet. They were not prepared for a war against 8 billion angry, resourceful, and profoundly stubborn civilians. The first V'tharr Legion landed in what was once London. They secured the primary spaceport with textbook precision, their plasma lances making short work of the token resistance from the local constabulary. They then began their march towards the city center, their formations perfect, their golden banners held high. They were conquerors, and they expected to be met with fear and submission. They were met with a traffic jam, a convoy of ancient, soot-belching diesel trucks, driven by a group of grim-faced men and women, had formed a barricade, completely blocking the main thoroughfare. The V'tharr commander, confused by this primitive and utterly non-military obstacle, ordered his troops to clear the way. As the Sunblades approached, the truck drivers simply got out, locked their doors, and walked away, melting into the labyrinthine city streets. The V'tharr were left with a wall of inert, heavy machinery. Their elegant anti-grav skimmers, designed for open battlefields, struggled to navigate the cramped, narrow streets. Their warriors, accustomed to honorable duels, were now faced with the mundane, infuriating task of trying to move a 20-ton truck. It was just the beginning. As the V'tharr legions pushed deeper into the world's cities, they found themselves in a new kind of hell. This was not a battlefield. It was a quagmire of civilian defiance. The infrastructure which they had planned to seize and utilize turned against them. Power grids would inexplicably fail, plunging entire districts into darkness. Water mains would burst, flooding key intersections. Automated traffic systems would go haywire, creating gridlock that trapped V'tharr patrols for hours. These were not coordinated military attacks. They were 1,000 small acts of sabotage carried out by ordinary people. An electrical engineer, sitting in his basement, would hack into the city's power grid and shunt power away from the occupied zones. A sanitation worker would accidentally cause a blockage in a sewer line beneath a V'tharr barracks. A teenage girl, a gifted coder, would turn a city's network of public information screens into a platform for broadcasting anti-V'tharr propaganda and crude, insulting caricatures of the High Exarch. The V'tharr, a species that revered order and predictability, were drowning in a sea of chaotic, civilian-led insurgency. Their advanced technology was often useless. Their plasma lances could level a building, but they couldn't fix a sabotaged water pump. Their powerful sensors could detect a hidden military installation, but they couldn't find a single grandmother who was secretly mixing homemade explosives in her kitchen. 70-year-old Maria Flores, a retired chemistry teacher in Mexico City, became a local legend. From her small apartment, using common household chemicals and knowledge gleaned from a century of human scientific progress, she manufactured a highly effective, low-yield explosive. She would pack it into clay pots filled with chili seeds, a nod to her famous garden, and leave them in the local market. The V'tharr, intrigued by the exotic flora, would often take the pots back to their barracks as souvenirs. The resulting small but numerous explosions caused minimal casualties, but the psychological impact was immense. The V'tharr soldiers became paranoid, seeing a potential threat in every harmless object, every smiling civilian. The occupation was not a military operation. It was a planet-wide pest control problem, and the humans were the most resilient, inventive, and infuriatingly stubborn pests the galaxy had ever seen. The V'tharr's greatest strength, their technological superiority, became their greatest vulnerability. Human society was a vast interconnected network, a chaotic but incredibly resilient web of data streams, communication satellites, and personal devices. The V'tharr attempted to seize control of this network to impose their own ordered, elegant system upon it. They were met by a ghost, an entity they could not see, could not understand, and could not defeat. They called it the human anomaly. It was not a single hacker, but the collective, decentralized intelligence of millions of human coders, engineers, and tech-savvy teenagers, all working independently but towards a common goal. V'tharr, command and control systems designed for perfect unfirewalled efficiency, were a hacker's paradise. Human insurgents, operating from bedrooms and internet cafes, launched a relentless barrage of cyber attacks. They didn't try to crash the V'tharr's systems, that would be too crude. Instead, they introduced Inconveniences. A V'tharr. Commander's meticulously planned patrol route would be subtly altered, leading his troops into a prearranged ambush. The targeting software on a V'tharr dropship would experience a minor calibration error, causing it to land a few kilometers off course, in the middle of a heavily fortified resistance zone. The V'tharr's own supply chain logistics, a marvel of automated efficiency, would be plagued by 1,000 tiny errors. A shipment of energy cells sent to the wrong continent, a food delivery contaminated with an aggressively spicy human condiment, a consignment of spare parts for their plasma lances mysteriously replaced with several tons of glitter. The effect was a slow, grinding erosion of V'tharr operational capacity. Their soldiers, already on edge from the constant low-level physical resistance, were now plagued by technological failures that made their lives even more miserable. A young man in Seoul, who went by the online handle Gosu, became a phantom of legend. He was not a soldier. He was a professional gamer, a master of strategy and psychological warfare in the virtual realm. From his cluttered apartment, surrounded by empty noodle cups and glowing monitors, he waged a one-man war against the V'tharr's orbital command. He didn't try to hack their warships. He hacked their entertainment systems. He replaced the V'tharr's serene melodic ambient music with a non-stop loop of a particularly obnoxious pre-integration pop song. He filled their tactical displays with adorable but incredibly distracting animated cat videos. He even managed to insert a subtle, maddeningly persistent typo into all of their official communiques, turning Glorious Imperium into Glorious Imperium. The effect on V'tharr morale was devastating. The Sunblades, warriors who had faced down the horrors of the void without flinching, were being driven to the brink of madness by a catchy pop tune and a grammatical error. The human anomaly was everywhere and nowhere. It was the collective, chaotic, and often childishly brilliant spirit of human ingenuity, and it was a weapon the V'tharr had no defense against. High Exarch Tavlak watched the daily reports from Earth, his serene composure long since shattered, replaced by a permanent expression of bewildered frustration. His legions were bogged down in a dozen different urban quagmires. His soldiers were exhausted, paranoid, and suffering from a host of stress-related ailments. His technologically advanced occupation force was being systematically dismantled by a planet of angry gardeners, mischievous teenagers, and disgruntled office workers. He had tried to crush the resistance. He had leveled entire city blocks in retaliation for a single act of sabotage. The result? The resistance intensified. The humans, it seemed, had a cultural history that treated martyrdom not as a tragedy, but as a recruitment tool. He had tried to win them over. He had broadcast messages of peace and prosperity, promising a golden age under the benevolent rule of the Imperium. The humans had responded by hacking his broadcast, replacing his noble visage with that of a cartoon pig, and setting his eloquent speech to a clownish tuba soundtrack. There were no armies to fight. There were no leaders to negotiate with. There was only the endless, grinding, and utterly infuriating resistance of an entire species. Sub-Commander Lethal, his own ceremonial armor now dented and scorched from a close encounter with one of Maria Flores's chili pot bombs, approached the High Exarch with a grim report. "High Exarch," he chirped, his voice lacking its usual melodic grace. "The situation on Earth is untenable. Our casualty rates are low, but our equipment failure rates are at 87%. Our soldiers are suffering from what the human medical texts call combat fatigue and acute caffeine withdrawal. Our supply lines are in chaos. We have conquered the planet, but we cannot hold it. The natives, sir. They are simply too annoying." Tavlak looked out at the blue and white jewel of Earth, a planet that had become his personal hell. He had won the war, by every metric. The V'tharr understood, and yet he had been utterly and completely defeated. He had conquered their military, but he had failed to conquer their spirit, and he was beginning to understand that for this strange, chaotic species, The two were not the same thing. He had a choice. He could continue this unwinnable occupation, bleeding his Imperium dry in a futile attempt to pacify a planet of intractable insurgents. Or he could do the unthinkable. He could retreat. He could admit that the V'tharr, the glorious conquerors of 1,000 worlds, had been defeated not by a superior army, but by a superior capacity for being a colossal pain in the backside. The V'tharr withdrawal from Earth was not a grand ceremonial affair. It was a hasty, ignominious retreat. Their legions, weary and demoralized, scrambled back to their dropships, harried every step of the way by a final planet-wide symphony of human defiance. Car horns blared, fireworks, mostly homemade, lit up the sky, and every public address system on the planet broadcast a triumphant, and frankly rather rude, farewell song. As the last V'tharr ship lifted off from the scarred but defiantly unbroken surface of Earth, High Exarch T'Vlak looked down one last time at the planet that had shattered his army's morale and his own serene composure. He had come as a conqueror, a benevolent guide for a primitive species. He was leaving as the butt of a global joke. He had made one fundamental catastrophic mistake in his analysis of humanity. He had studied their wars, their divisions, their fears, but he had failed to understand the one unifying principle that bound them all together, their stubborn, collective, and utterly indomitable refusal to be told what to do. He had not been fighting an army. He had been fighting a species. He had been fighting the home front. The V'tharr fleet, battered and bewildered, limped back to their own space, leaving behind a planet that was already busy rebuilding, its people united in a way they had not been for centuries. They had faced down a galactic empire, not with a grand fleet or a mighty army, but with the simple, unyielding power of their collective spirit. The galaxy was stunned. The V'tharr Imperium, the unstoppable force, had been repelled by a species they had already technically defeated. The reports from Earth were analyzed with a mixture of disbelief and dawning respect. The other great powers of the galaxy began to see humanity in a new light. They were not just builders and talkers. They were something else. They were a species that did not place its strength solely in its armies, but in its people. Ambassador Aris Thorn, no relation, now representing a victorious and unbowed Terran Federation, returned to the Galactic Concordat. He was no longer the polite, unassuming mediator. He was the representative of a species that had just taught the galaxy a profound and terrifying lesson. The other ambassadors looked at him with a new deference. They had seen the fleets, the armies, the shining warriors, but they had never seen a weapon as powerful as an entire planet of defiant civilians. A quiet, unspoken understanding settled over the galactic community. You could fight the Terran fleet, you could even perhaps defeat it, but you could never, ever, under any circumstances, try to occupy Earth. The home front was not a place, it was a state of being, and it was the most powerful, most resilient, and most utterly infuriating force the galaxy had ever seen. The V'tharr had learned this lesson the hard way, and the rest of the galaxy, watching from a safe distance, took careful, meticulous notes. The age of conventional warfare was over. The age of the belligerent civilian had begun.